She was my boss. I was supposed to keep my distance, but love doesn't follow rules, especially at 5 a.m. I woke up at exactly 5 a.m. to a knock that didn't belong in my life. Not at that hour, not in my quiet apartment where nothing ever happened. And for a moment I thought I was still dreaming, because who knocks on a door at dawn unless something is terribly wrong? And my heart started racing before my mind could catch up. Every beat louder than the last as the knock came. Again slow, unsure, almost fragile, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, telling myself to ignore it, telling myself it couldn't be meant for me, but something deep in my chest already knew it was. So I dragged myself out of bed, barefoot on the cold floor, my body heavy with sleep and dread. And when I reached the door and pressed my eye to the peephole, the world tilted, because she was standing there, my CEO, the woman whose name made entire boardrooms fall silent, the woman I only ever saw in tailored suits and sharp confidence. Now wrapped in a thin coat, her hair loose and messy, her face pale and drawn, eyes red like she'd cried all night. And for a second I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because she didn't belong here, not in my hallway, not in my life. And yet when I opened the door and she looked up at me, her voice barely louder than a whisper as she said my name, I felt something break inside me that I didn't even know was already cracked. I stepped aside without thinking. Now wrapped in a thin coat, her hair loose and messy, her face pale and drawn, eyes red like she'd cried all night. And for a second I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because she didn't belong here, not in my hallway, not in my life. And yet when I opened the door and she looked up at me, her voice barely louder than a whisper as she said my name, I felt something break inside me that I didn't even know was already cracked. I stepped aside without thinking, adding her in, the smell of cold air and exhaustion following her, and she stood there like she didn't know what to do with her own body, hands clasped together, shoulders tense, no trace of the powerful woman I worked for every day. And all I could think was how small my apartment suddenly felt with her in it, how wrong and right it felt at the same time, because for years I had watched her from a distance, admired her strength, her control, the way she walked through chaos without flinching, and I had loved her quietly, painfully, knowing it was impossible, knowing I was just an employee, just another name on her calendar. But standing there at 5 a.m., seeing her like this, I realized I had never truly seen her before. I offered her water, coffee, anything, my voice shaking, even as I tried to sound calm, and she nodded but didn't drink, just Saturday on the edge of my couch, like she was afraid it might disappear beneath her, her eyes scanning the room as if she needed proof she was really here. And the silence between us grew thick, pressing against my ears until I could hear my own breathing, and in that silence my thoughts spiraled, because everyone at work knew she had finalized her divorce last week. The headlines, the whispers, the sudden tension in meetings, but none of us knew the truth. And looking at her now, I could tell it wasn't a clean break. It wasn't freedom. It was survival. She stared at her hands for a long time before speaking, and when she finally did, her voice trembled in a way I had never heard before, saying she didn't know where else to go, that every place she thought of felt empty or hostile. And that scared me more than tears would have, because this was a woman who always knew exactly where to go, exactly what to do, and hearing her admit she was lost made my chest ache. I wanted to reach for her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I stayed still, painfully aware of the line between us, the line I had never dared to cross, the line that had kept my feelings buried for years. And as she spoke in fragments about the house that no longer felt like home, about nights spent awake beside someone who felt like a stranger, about how success didn't protect her from loneliness, he felt every word like a bruise forming under my skin, because I had seen her surrounded by people every day, praised, respected, feared, and yet she had never once looked more alone than she did sitting on my couch at dawn. My mind kept pulling me back to all the small moments I had ignored before, the way she lingered after meetings, the way her eyes softened when she spoke to me alone, the way she trusted me with things she trusted no one else with. And I wondered if I had been blind, or if I had simply been too afraid to hope. She apologized for coming unannounced, for being weak, and that word hit me harder than anything else, because she wasn't weak, she was just human. And I told her that, my voice low but firm, telling her she didn't need to apologize, that she was safe here. And when she looked at me then, really looked at me, something in her expression shifted, like she was holding back a storm, and for a moment I thought she might cry, but instead she swallowed hard and said she trusted me more than anyone, that she always had. And my heart clenched painfully at the weight of those words, because trust was the most dangerous gift she could give me. I felt torn in two, part of me wanting to protect her at all costs, part of me terrified that this moment would destroy everything I had built. My career, my boundaries, my carefully controlled emotions. And as the sky outside began to lighten, the darkness inside me deepened. Because I knew this wasn't just a visit, this wasn't just a breakdown. This was the beginning of something I wasn't ready for, something that would force me to confront feelings I had buried for too long. And as she finally whispered that she hadn't come just for comfort, that there was something she needed to say but didn't know how, I realized with a sinking certainty that whatever came next would change my life forever, and there would be no going back to the quiet, lonely safety I had known before. She sat there for a long time after saying she had something to confess, and that silence felt heavier than any scream, because I could hear my own heart beating in my ears, could feel every breath scrape through my chest as I waited, afraid that whatever she was about to say would either heal me or destroy me completely. And when she finally looked up at me, her eyes were glassy, not with power or authority, but with fear, the kind of fear that comes from standing at the edge of your own truth. And she told me she had spent years pretending she was strong, pretending she didn't need anyone, pretending love was a weakness she couldn't afford. But the truth was she had been lonely long before her marriage ended, lonely even when she slept beside someone every night. And as she spoke, her voice cracked, and I realized I was watching a woman unlearn everything she had been taught to survive. She admitted that her divorce wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the collapse of a life she had lived for too long, a life built on status and expectations, not on warmth or safety. And when she said she used to sit in meetings watching me take notes, listening more than I spoke, always calm, always steady, I felt my throat tighten, because I had never imagined she noticed me that way. And she told me that I made her feel human in a world where everyone treated her like a title instead of a person. I wanted to interrupt her, to tell her she didn't owe me an explanation, but I stayed silent, afraid that if I spoke, I would lose control of the fragile balance between us. And then she said my name again, softer this time, like it belonged to her, and confessed that she had loved me quietly, painfully, just like I had loved her, that she had fought it every day because she was my boss, because the world would never forgive a woman like her for wanting someone like me. And those words shattered something inside me, because all the nights I spent convincing myself my feelings were one-sided suddenly came rushing back. All the restraint, all the distance, all the times I chose silence over hope. I told her the truth then, my voice trembling as I admitted I had loved her long before she ever noticed me, loved her strength, her discipline, the way she carried the weight of everyone's expectations without complaint, and that loving her had been the hardest thing I had ever done, because it meant wanting someone I could never have. And as I spoke, tears blurred my vision, not because I was ashamed, but because I was finally honest. She stood up slowly, and for a moment I thought she was going to leave, thought this confession was too much, but instead she stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence, close enough that the air between us felt charged. And she reached out, hesitated, then rested her forehead against my chest, not asking for permission, not demanding anything, just seeking shelter. An instinct took over as I wrapped my arms around her, holding her carefully, like she might break if I held too tight. She cried then, quietly, the kind of crying that comes from years of restraint, and every tear felt like it soaked straight into my skin. And in that moment she wasn't a CEO, wasn't powerful or untouchable. She was just a woman who had finally run out of strength. And I stayed with her in that silence, breathing with her, grounding her, knowing that love wasn't always about passion. Sometimes it was about being the place someone could fall apart safely. When she finally pulled back, she looked up at me with a softness that made my chest ache, and she told me she didn't know what this meant for us, didn't know if love was enough to bridge the gap between our worlds, but she knew she couldn't keep lying to herself anymore. And I told her I didn't need promises, didn't need certainty, I just needed truth. And hearing that made her smile through her tears, a small, fragile smile that felt more intimate than any kiss. We sat there together as the sun began to rise, the room filling with pale light, talking quietly about things we had never said before, about fear and regret and the strange timing of love. And when she eventually stood to leave, slipping her coat back on, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, afraid that this was goodbye. But she stopped at the door and turned back, her eyes steady now, and said this wasn't the end, just the beginning of something real, something honest. And as the door closed behind her, I stood there alone, changed forever, knowing that love hadn't saved us yet, but it had finally found us. And sometimes that was enough to survive the night.